I remember my mom saying that when she looked in his eyes, it was like looking in the eyes of the devil. When I think back on it, I really, really wish I would listen.
I just want you to start from the beginning.
She would ask me, how did I feel about her getting married? And I told her that I didn't like it.
This is the man you're going to marry, and you're not going to tell him that your lover is going to blow his brains out?
He was like, I told you if I couldn't have you, nobody could. I was scared, and I was like, I don't want to go to jail.
She told me she loved me. She said, do you know what we could do with that money? She was like, well, you could get a try.
And he told me that if I told anybody, that he'd come back and he'd kill my whole family.
She was like, so when are we going to do this? She said, all I got to do is come down to some sex and come.
He was very, very good at manipulation. I think he just wanted the control.
He assassinated your husband, okay? Let's call it what it is. And you knew it was going to happen, and you did nothing to stop it.
He was a good guy. He didn't deserve what happened to him at all.
New Year's Day, 1993. Dispatchers in Mansfield, Ohio, receive a worried call about a missing 18-year-old.
There was a missing persons report filed by Hope Lothery, the mother of Jason Lothery. Jason at the time was home on leave from the U.S. Army. He'd gone to basic training in Fort Jackson, South Carolina, and he was home on leave from basic training, waiting his next duty station at Fort Carson, Colorado. She said that Jason had gone out the night before, New Year's Eve, about 11:30, in her car, which was a 1993 blue Chevy Cavalier, and was going out to visit some relatives, and that he never returned.
He was supposed to be home that night to celebrate with his mother because Jason Lothery had just gotten married on December 30th, and he was about to set off for Colorado with his new bride in just a few days.
His mom got concerned, and she had called his new bride, Amanda.
Amanda had said that her and Jason had been out the night before. Jason had driven her home, and he had left.
Apparently, Amanda had agreed to spend the night with her mother, New Year's Eve, despite the fact they were newlyweds.
He was all right with it, her husband, because he wanted to spend time with his mother before he took off back in the Army.
Amanda had no idea where he had gone and hadn't seen him since he had dropped her off.
I'm not sure if Jason's mom came to my house or if she called. I can't really recall it. But I was freaking out, and I was just like, oh my God. Like, I didn't know what to do, So the cops came and stuff, and they started questioning me, and it was like I was just living in a nightmare, and I was like, this ain't real. Like, that's all I kept saying to myself. I was like, it's not real. Like, it's going to be okay. Like, you know what I'm saying? Jason's going to come home, and it's going to be fine.
We obviously checked the hospital. Hope had called all family and friends looking for Jason. No one had a clue where he was at. But at 11:35 in the morning, a private citizen called in who had found the vehicle just inadvertently.
The vehicle was over an embankment down by the railroad tracks in the north end of town in a secluded area,
which was about a mile and a half from the Lothery home. Mansfield police responded, and it was Hope Lothery's missing vehicle that Jason was last seen in.
But Jason's not at the scene, no one's at the scene. In the car, we found Jason's jacket, and it had a lot of blood on the jacket and in the car.
There was a large amount of blood on the driver's side headrest. There was copious amounts of blood there, and with Jason being missing, this didn't look good for him.
Born in 1974, Jason Lothery was the epitome of all-American.
We were in classes together. He was National Honor Society. He was a good kid. He was a very polite, friendly person.
In high school, he had good grades. He was honor society. He was, all the good things.
He liked to play basketball. He'd be on the basketball court and mixing it up at lunch during open gym.
16-year-old Amanda Branham was a grade below Jason at the same high school.
I knew Jason for years. He lived up the street from me. His cousin was my best friend. We went to school together.
Amanda is very friendly. She doesn't know a stranger. She'll include anybody in her group.
At first, it was just like we were all just like friends, But then me and Jason, we just clicked one day. He was sweet, caring. People loved him. My parents loved him.
Jason was a boy that everybody's parents wanted their daughters to date. The perfect guy.
We would just ride around and just talk and listen to music. And if I wasn't at his house, he was at my house. It was just, we were in our own world.
Less than a year after they fell in love, in the spring of 1992, Jason graduated and enlisted in the Army.
Before Jason went to boot camp, he asked me to marry him. Of course, I said yes, but I'm 17 years old at the time, so we didn't plan to get married until after I graduated school. So we had made our marriage date for June of 93. We thought that he was going to be able to stay in Ohio, but the military, they were saying that they was going to station him in Colorado. So he had asked me, he was like, I want you to go with me. I was ready to just get out of Mansfield and start my life, so we moved our wedding date up to December. And I dropped out of school. We had made a whole plan that when we got to Colorado, I was going to get my GED. I was going to go to cosmetology school because I wanted to do hair. So, we had a whole plan.
On December 30th, 1992, Amanda and Jason were married in a small ceremony in Mansfield.
His parents came, my parents came, my sister, a few of the friends. We were very happy, but that changed when this happened.
Now, only 2 days after his wedding, the car Jason had been driving has been found covered in blood.
The car was towed to the Mansfield Police Department so the crime lab could process it for evidence.
Because of the amount of blood, we believed that we were dealing with a homicide at that point.
So since Amanda, his wife of one day, was the last person allegedly that had been with him or seen him, we thought she was a key to the investigation, and we interviewed her right away.
When Amanda goes down to the police station, she's very upset. She's worried about where Jason could be.
They said that they had found the car. My mind was all over the place.
That's when Amanda reveals that Jason had gotten involved with some local drug dealers named Capri Smith and Anthony Parents.
She said they were going to harm Jason, and she didn't know the extent of the harm that they wanted to do to him. We were familiar with Capri Smith from other police dealings.
She said Anthony Parents had some long-standing grudge against Jason and had threatened to kill him. She said that the night of the 26th, they were all at the Moto Mart and that Anthony wanted to fight Jason and that Jason wouldn't go out and fight. We had no reason to doubt Amanda, but we wanted to clear her first of any knowledge. So we asked her if she'd take a polygraph, and she agreed. Her answers were that she had no knowledge, direct involvement in Jason's disappearance.
She passed the polygraph with flying colors.
After the polygraph, I went back on station, and within an hour, I got a call from a citizen that said that Amanda Lothry and her sister had come to their house screaming and that they had found Jason's body in a ravine. I thought, well, she just passed this polygraph, supposedly, and drives there directly to where the body's at, and yet claims no knowledge. So what's the chances of that?
Coming up, as a homicide investigation ignites, another murder leads to more questions.
That was strange that we would have these two homicides close together. We don't believe in coincidences.
And the search for justice will lead to a shocking revelation.
When we found this out, that this was kind of a love triangle thing going on there, it gave us a motive.
Less than an hour after questioning 17-year-old Amanda Lothry in connection with her husband Jason's disappearance, detectives have just received a call that Amanda has made a terrible discovery.
She had indicated her and her sister had gone out looking for Jason and came upon his body in this particular wooded area.
My sister got out of the car and she just started looking. And then she seen him. I remember just getting this sinking feeling in my stomach, and I just started crying.
Her and the sister then went on foot to a random house nobody they knew and called the police from there.
I went to the scene, and we found that Jason was thrown over this bank into a ravine. He had obvious wounds to the back of his head, which appeared to me to be gunshot wounds, and we could see abrasions on Jason's body that would indicate that he had been dragged.
But there were no bullet casings, anything of that nature found at the scene.
The vehicle is located about 2.5 miles due north of where the body was found. The large amount of blood in the vehicle suggested that he was murdered in the vehicle, but we didn't know whether that happened where the vehicle was located or at the scene where he was recovered.
Where Jason's body is ultimately discovered, that area was an odd location for Amanda to be looking in because it isn't in close proximity to where they lived or where he would have gone.
And so we talked to Amanda at the scene where Jason was found.
So Amanda said this spot is where drug dealers have been known to frequent.
She said she went there because that's where, Anthony and Capri did their dirty work, and that's how she happened to be there. So we didn't take another formal statement at that time. We just talked to her.
Can't say that they was really consoling, but I think that they were just doing their job.
The coroner was called to the scene, and the coroner dictated the body be transferred to the Mansfield General Hospital morgue for autopsy.
I got word that Jason had passed the same night that they found him. I was quite shocked. Couldn't believe that someone as good as him had life cut short.
I didn't eat. I couldn't sleep. It was almost like I was walking in a dream. Everything was just surreal.
At this point, we're definitely looking at a homicide. So we're checking alibis, we're checking leads. Amanda had stated that Anthony Parents and Capri Smith frequently ran together, and that Anthony had threatened to kill Jason in the past. So obviously we contacted Anthony Parents and Capri Smith about this. They both were known to law enforcement and had police records.
Caprice and Anthony, when they were questioned, they had no knowledge of what we were talking about, and they gave alibis.
We knew that the murder occurred sometime between 11:30, the night before, and when he was found at about 3:55, the next day on January 1st. We checked out both their alibis, and they were solid. They were at parties with numerous people that could vouch for their presence there. They had no involvement in Jason Lothry's murder.
At that point, we had nothing more to go on.
Back at square one, detectives review another homicide case that occurred just 4 days before Jason's murder to determine if there is any possible connection.
Mansfield is not that high of a rate in terms of crime, but suddenly had 2 murders within days of one another.
We'd average about 4 or 5 murders a year, so it was unusual to have that many murders in that time span. Before Jason's murder, I'd gotten called in the early morning hours of December 27th for an apparent homicide. The man was shot in the left eye. His name was Scott Cox.
Scotty Cox was in the bar with a friend, and they were having a drink.
We talked to the man that was with Scott Cox. He said that they were leaving the bar. These two individuals were coming eastbound on 4th Street.
Scotty Cox had bumped into these two guys. He described them as one tall and one short. Other than that, he couldn't tell us white, black, anything else about them.
Words were exchanged between them, and that the taller male pulled out a gun, a pistol, and shot Scott Cox in the face. And they ran away from him.
It was just, you just feel numb, I guess, just shock. Why Scotty? Scotty didn't have any enemies.
We all broke down as a family, couldn't believe it happened. He wasn't a troublemaker, so we didn't know why it happened.
Both Jason and Scott were assassinated by bullets to the head, but detectives still aren't sure if they're connected.
There's always this fear that if you find these sort of connected murders, that more violence or more murders may result. Later on, people start coming forward and providing information, and the connection then is developed.
On January 1st, 1993, Mansfield detectives are investigating the murder of 18-year-old Jason Lothry and trying to determine if it's connected to another recent homicide.
Scott Cox was murdered on December 27th, 1992, in Mansfield, just days before Jason Lothry was murdered.
At the time, we were kind of still in the dark. We just had heard that it was another tragedy yet in Mansfield, and they were still trying to put things together.
Jason's body was taken to the Mansfield General Morgue at the direction of the coroner for an autopsy, which he performed the next morning. He determined that manner of death was homicide, and cause of death was 3 gunshot wounds to the head. Some bullet fragments were recovered from Jason's head, were turned over for comparison.
It was a homicide by gunshot, a small caliber gun, and it turned out to be a .22 caliber.
The weapon that was determined to kill Scott Cox was a .38 caliber Smith & Wesson. And so we had nothing at that point to connect the two deaths.
Despite the different murder weapons, detectives continue to investigate the homicide side by side.
We thought that was strange that we would have these two homicides close together. We don't believe in coincidences.
We had 6 to 8 detectives working on this at the time. After the word got out on Jason's murder, after it was in the papers and everything, we started getting phone calls from the different high schools that students thought they might have some knowledge about this murder. We found out from these students that all hung around together that this man, Rajhi Render, didn't like Jason.
Rajhi Render wanted to fight, have it out with Jason so they could settle their differences.
Render was also known to hang around with a guy by the name of Aaron Bryant, and so his name was also offered up to police.
So we had to check him out. Rajhi TC Render had been involved in the system before on that weapons charge. TC's a nickname he gave himself, Totally Cool or Too Cool. Aaron Bryant was living down the street from him. They were supposedly best friends, and if you use the geography of it, Render and Bryant both live close to where Scott Cox was murdered.
Myself and Detective Jim Gadd went out to pick them up to talk.
The thing that stood out about Aaron was on the Scott Cox murder, witnesses said one was a really short male, about 5'4", and Aaron Bryant was about 5'4".
And TC was taller, so in the back of my mind, I'm saying these two guys fit the description we had from the Cox homicide.
At the station, detectives asked TC and Aaron about the murders of Jason Lothry and Scott Cox.
They denied any involvement in it. T.C. Render and Aaron Bryant had alibis that on late night December 26th, early morning December 27th, there was a kind of a party going on in the basement. And again, on New Year's Eve, they were there all night for a party until 5 in the morning. At the time, Aaron Bryant was living with his girlfriend, Julie Crosby, and her father was Clarence Crosby. I contacted Clarence Crosby, the male head of household there, and confided into him what was going on, that there had been 2 murders. We thought Aaron might be involved.
On January 4th, Clarence and his daughter Julie agree to come to the station, where they're separated for questioning.
I asked him, had he heard anything? Had he seen anything? He was surprised to hear that Aaron could be involved, and that he said, he didn't know anything about it, hadn't heard anything, but he'd let us know. So we next talked to Julie Crosby, Aaron's girlfriend. She was 18, had a young baby, and questioned her.
Julie Crosby was given indications to police that she was nervous, so they had thought that she knew something.
Julie at first denied any knowledge.
Then Detective Wendling came in and pretty much slammed his fist on the table and was like, "You have got to tell us what is going on."
It was explained to her what an accessory to murder could mean, what kind of charge that could mean, what kind of effect that could have on her life, with her young child and everything. And she then broke down. She said Aaron confessed to her that T.C. Render and Aaron Bryant, they had inadvertently killed Scott Cox.
It was like the floodgates being opened.
4 days into the investigation of the New Year's Eve murder of Jason Lothry, Mansfield detectives have received information that Rajhi T.C. Render and Aaron Bryant were involved in another recent murder, that of Scott Cox.
Once we interviewed Julie Crosby, it kind of cracked the case open.
While at the house one night, Julie had overheard a discussion between T.C. Render and Clarence Crosby, her father, about wanting to borrow a weapon. T.C. was looking for a gun.
T.C. had been supplied that .38 caliber Smith & Wesson by Clarence Crosby, along with ammunition.
The discussion then entered into the fact that T.C. intended to use this gun to ambush Jason Lothry.
According to Julie, the day after T.C. borrowed the gun, he and Aaron returned to the house in a panic.
December 27th, T.C. and Aaron ran back to her house and gave Clarence Crosby the weapon back.
They were kind of on edge. They were riled up.
They said Scotty Cox ran into Aaron on the street, bumped into him. Words were exchanged.
They had an argument with Scott, and T.C. raised the gun in front of Scott. Scott supposedly batted it away. The gun was raised again, and he was shot. Scott Cox just happened to be at the wrong place at the wrong time.
Julie says her father then supplied T.C. with a new gun, this time a .22.
Clarence had prior knowledge. His plan was to kill Jason and still supplied the ammunition as well as the weapons. We didn't know why he did that. The rest of these were 17, 18, 19-year-olds, and Clarence was an adult. December 31st, Julie told us that T.C. Render came back and gave Clarence Crosby the .22 revolver back. They said it was used to kill Jason Lothry.
So the 2 murders were actually connected.
When detectives asked Julie why T.C. wanted to kill Jason Lothry, she says the entire plot revolved around Jason's wife.
Apparently, T.C. and Amanda had been an item.
They found out Amanda and T.C. had been on and off for some time, but this information was withheld from police by Amanda.
Julie advised that Amanda and TC had remained in that relationship even though she had started a relationship with Jason and committed to marrying him. And the idea was that TC wanted him dead because he wanted to be with Amanda. Julie also indicated that Amanda was well aware of what was going to transpire.
Now Amanda had passed a polygraph. I will admit the polygraph's not a panacea. People can pass polygraphs and still be 100% guilty.
When we found this out, that this was kind of a love triangle thing going on here, it gave us a motive.
Armed with his daughter's statement, detectives circled back to Clarence and confront him with the allegations.
He basically confirmed what Julie had told us, that he had supplied both weapons, the .22 revolver that was used to kill Jason Lothry and the .38 revolver for Scott Cox.
Following Clarence's interview, detectives head to his home to collect evidence.
From there, we recovered the .38 caliber revolver.
The bullet casings were buried in the backyard. Clarence showed us approximately where they were, and we dug them up.
We later recovered the .22 H&R revolver that was used in Jason Lothry's murder. We felt we had probable cause to make arrests on Amanda, TC, and Aaron.
On January 4th, investigators arrest TC Render.
We found TC first. We were searching a residence that we had information he was at. We put him on the ground, handcuffed him.
Detectives arrest Aaron Bryant at a friend's house the same day, before setting their sights on Amanda Lothry.
I was at Jason's wake. They came in and asked me to come outside. And then when they got me outside, they said that I was under arrest for the murder of Jason. It was almost like I had all these voices in my mind, like screaming. And I'm like, you're arresting me? I didn't even do it.
Amanda was taken to the Detective Bureau for a statement.
Are you in love with TC?
No.
Have you ever been in love with him?
No.
It's so hard for me to remember like everything back then. I was scared, and I was like, I don't want to go to jail. I just know that during their investigation, I misled them, and I lied.
4 days into the investigation, Amanda Lothry has been taken into custody in connection to the murder of her young husband, Jason. According to an eyewitness, Amanda had prior knowledge that her alleged lover, Rajhi T.C. Render, wanted to murder Jason in order to be with her.
Would you explain your relationship to me with TC, what it has been all along?
We saw each other on and off, but when Jason left, it was just a friendship.
I met TC when I'd say maybe I was like 14, I think. He was like 17. And I was like, oh, he's kind of cute.
TC had been, a popular guy. He had a reputation for being like a ladies' man.
My parents didn't like him. I remember my mom saying that when she looked in his eyes, it was like looking in the eyes of the devil. He cheated on me a lot. So eventually I got to a point to where I just started like seeing other guys and, basically doing me.
When Amanda and TC broke up, she started talking to Jason. Her parents were thrilled. You could tell they really liked Jason a lot.
We knew that after Jason went off to join the Army, TC moved right back in to his relationship with Amanda.
She admitted that they were still seeing each other.
Would you now tell me what you know about that incident? I just want you to start from the beginning.
When TC found out that me and Jason had got engaged, he had made a comment to somebody. He was like, I'll shoot up that whole wedding if she thinks she's getting married.
He was going to shoot him. Did you tell Jason that?
I made hints towards Jason.
Hints? This is the man you're going to marry the following Wednesday? You're wearing his wedding band right now, and you're not going to tell him that your lover is going to blow his brains out?
When TC had made that comment and got back to me, I was like, well, I don't believe that. TC ain't gonna, you know what I mean? So I took it with a grain of salt. Maybe that was my mistake. I didn't want to believe it. I mean, I'm 17 years old, you know? So the 31st, I worked at Wendy's. I was closing that night. Jason come and pick me up. But when I came out of Wendy's, TC and Jason was out in the parking lot talking. And so I walked up and I was like, what's going on? And Jason was like, TC wants us to go out, you know, for a while tonight or whatever. I was like, well, take me home so I could change first. So we dropped him off at home and then went to my house and I changed clothes and then we left. And then we went and picked up TC.
We went riding around and we went to the Galaxy Goose to get some stuff to drink or whatever that TC bought.
Jason was like lightweight. So like he started swerving on the road a little bit. And I was like, Jason, pull over the car.
So Jason pulled back there and he backed the car up and turned off the lights. So I got out of the car with him because I went to the bathroom, like back in the woods and stuff. And next thing I know, I started hearing these gunshots and stuff. So I run up there and I see TC dragging Jason out of the car. And I'm asking TC, what's going on?
And then like I seen Jason, I just realized like he was dead. TC just dumped him over to the side. I'm sorry.
Amanda Lothry told police that she was fearful of Render and just went along with whatever he wanted.
I just thought she really had kind of a flat affect for everything. It wasn't a show of emotion that, you know, she was sorry for all this.
TC was like, I told you if I couldn't have you, nobody could. Eventually, I finally got him to let me go home. And he told me that if I told anybody, they'd come back and he'd kill my whole family. He was very, very good at, I guess you could say, manipulation. I don't even really think that he wanted to be back with me. I think he just wanted to control.
He assassinated your husband, okay? Let's call it what it is. And you knew it was going to happen, and you did nothing to stop it.
My mom said that I always give benefit of the doubt to people, you know? I guess you'd call it naive or whatever back then. When I think back on it, I really, really wish I would have listened.
The fact that she sent her little sister, who was uninvolved in the whole thing, her over to find the body with her, I just thought that was awful.
Detectives finish their interview with Amanda and detain her in jail. The same day, they interview TC Render.
What we're going to discuss here are two homicides. The first is the William S. Cox homicide.
We find out December 26th, T.C. Render and Aaron Bryant had gone to the Moto Mart and tried to get Jason to come out and fight. And Jason wouldn't come out, and so they were going home when Scott Cox walked out of the bar.
Well, there was a fight. And he swung it. He shot him.
Jody, what you're saying is you're the one that shot Mr. Cox.
Yeah.
Do you want to tell us anything about Jason's death?
Well, I didn't shoot Jason.
You're saying that Andy's the one that shot Jason. Did you and Amanda have some type of conversation about her fiance?
Yeah. She would ask me how did I feel about her getting married, and I told her that I didn't like it, especially if she told me she loved me and all this. She asked me one time, did I know how much Jason was worth if she married him? And if he died or got killed or something. I told her no, she said, raised around $200,000 or something like that. And And she said, "Do you know what we could do with that money?" She was like, "Well, you could be at the trial."
So he said part of the motive for the shooting of Jason Lothry was that once she had married him, that she would be in line for Army insurance.
She was like, "So when are we going to do this?" She said, "I've set him up many times." She said, "All I got to do is tell him I have some sex and they'll come."
TC admits to acquiring the gun, but he maintains he never pulled the trigger. Instead, he says that when Amanda and Jason picked him up on New Year's Eve, Amanda had put her plan into action.
Man, she was like, she's turning up the music, so I'm turning up the music. And then she had hit him once. And at first he was just sitting there. What are you doing? She had shot him once. Where at? I don't know. It was somewhere in the head. He was just sitting up there like this. But it seemed like he was swaying back and forth. Then she shot him again.
I don't know if she hatched out the plan or he did, but I thought that they were both totally involved in it.
Ohio authorities have arrested Amanda Lothry and her alleged lover, Rajhi T.C. Render, for the murder of Amanda's husband, Jason Lothry. T.C., alongside his friend, Aaron Bryant, also stand accused of shooting a second man, Scott Cox, a few days before Jason's death.
T.C. Render was charged with conspiracy murder of Jason Lothry and conspiracy to commit murder for the murder of Scott Cox. Amanda was charged with conspiracy. Conspiracy in Ohio is a felony of the first degree. Aaron Bryant was originally charged with participating in the aggravated murder of Scott Cox. He was also charged with conspiracy to commit murder, which related to the murder of Mr. Lothry.
Clarence Crosby, the man who provided the murder weapons, is also charged.
Clarence was charged with aiding and abetting in the murder of Jason Lothry and 4 counts of tampering with evidence.
Aaron Bryant ended up reaching a plea agreement, so he was able to testify and did testify in the trial against Crosby, Amanda, and TC.
So since the allegations is this was a conspiracy, the court went forward with the idea that they would all 3 be tried together.
In May of 1993, opening arguments get underway.
Amanda was blaming TC and saying that he was manipulating her. She was fearful of him. She had no choice.
On the other side, you had TC, who claimed that Amanda was being manipulative.
Did I lie to the police? Yes, I did. I'll take that all day long. But to say that I sat down and maliciously plotted to kill somebody, no. No.
In response, the state calls multiple witnesses to prove the lovers conspired together.
You had Julie Crosby saying that Amanda would be on the phone with TC, and TC would be telling her, you got to get Jason out of the house. And Julie heard some of these conversations.
The general argument of the state was that Amanda had wanted to be with TC Render. They wanted the $200,000 insurance policy so that they could have a life together. And they were all fueled by greed and lust.
But at trial, Amanda claimed that she didn't know anything about it.
Literally, we had just got married. We never talked about no money or anything like that or no insurance policies. That's what they was building my case around. But I was never his beneficiary.
After 9 hours of deliberation, the jury came back with guilty verdicts on all counts. Mr. Render had very little reaction, neither did Mr. Crosby.
I felt like I was gonna die. I was like, there's no way. My life's gone because nobody wanted to listen to me.
They were all sentenced. Later, they had filed appeals that they hadn't been allowed a separate trial.
The decision to try them all together was grounds for appeal.
After the convictions were reversed, T.C. Render decided to go to trial again. He was again convicted. His sentence ultimately becomes 36 years to life for the aggravated murder of Jason Lothry and for the murder of Scott Cox.
And there were some plea deals among the others.
I agreed to the plea deal because my attorney at the time was saying, if you go through trial, you're looking at life.
Her sentence is 10 to 28 years in prison for her participation. Amanda served her entire 28 years.
I got out in January of 2021. When I first got out, I was very overwhelmed. I still felt like I had this wall up a little bit. I've tried to move forward with my life. This is something that, haunts me at times. Jason is a good guy. He didn't deserve what happened to him at all.
You should have had the chance to, be married for real and have children and experience life, and all that was cut short.
Jason Lothry had a wonderful life ahead of him. He had a lot to look forward to, and his loss was huge.
Berlin, Germany, January 1919. The Great War had ended only weeks earlier, but peace had not truly arrived. Across the city, the scars of conflict remained visible in shattered buildings, exhausted faces, and a political landscape that seemed ready to collapse under its own weight. The German Empire, once one of the most powerful states in Europe, had fallen apart. Kaiser Wilhelm II had abdicated. The old order was gone, yet the future remained uncertain. Different factions claimed to know what Germany should become next, and each believed that history was on its side. In the streets, arguments about politics no longer belonged solely in newspapers, speeches, or parliament chambers. Increasingly, they were settled through force. Demonstrations turned into clashes. Rivals became enemies, and enemies, in some cases, became targets. In this atmosphere of fear, hope, and revolutionary ambition, two of the most recognizable political figures in Germany found themselves at the center of a storm from which there would be no escape. Their names were Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht. For supporters, they represented courage and commitment to a radically different vision of society. They stood among the leading voices of a revolutionary movement that sought to reshape Germany after the devastation of war. To their critics, however, they represented instability, chaos, and the threat of a violent revolution similar to the one that had transformed Russia only 2 years earlier. Regardless of political opinion, almost everyone knew their names. They were not obscure activists operating in secret. They were public figures whose speeches, writings, and actions had made them symbols in one of the most important political struggles of their time. Yet on the evening of January 15, 1919, both would disappear into military custody. Within hours, they would be dead. At first glance, the official explanation appeared straightforward. Authorities announced that Karl Liebknecht had been shot while attempting to escape. Rosa Luxemburg, meanwhile, was reported to have been attacked and then vanished. To many observers living through those chaotic days, such reports may have seemed believable. Berlin was a city consumed by unrest. Violence had become common. Armed confrontations had erupted across the capital. Rumors spread faster than verified facts. In such an environment, extraordinary events could easily be accepted without scrutiny. But almost immediately, questions began to emerge. How exactly had Liebknecht attempted to escape? Why were there inconsistencies in the accounts surrounding Luxemburg's disappearance? Why did so many details remain unclear? And perhaps most importantly, why did the official explanation seem to satisfy so few people? As weeks turned into months and months into years, a different picture gradually emerged. Investigations, witness accounts, and historical research would eventually challenge the original narrative. What had been presented as the tragic outcome of chaotic circumstances increasingly appeared to be something else entirely. Rather than accidental deaths amid political turmoil, evidence suggested deliberate actions. Rather than spontaneous violence, there were indications of planning. Rather than a breakdown of authority, there were signs that authority itself may have played a central role. The deaths of Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht would come to be viewed by many historians not as random casualties of revolutionary unrest, but as one of the most significant political assassinations in modern German history. Yet this story is not merely about two killings. It is also about a nation standing at a crossroads. To understand why these deaths continue to provoke debate more than a century later, it is necessary to understand the world in which they occurred. Germany in early 1919 was not a stable democracy. It was a defeated empire struggling to reinvent itself. Millions had endured years of war. Countless families mourned lost fathers, sons, brothers, and husbands. Economic hardship was widespread. Faith in institutions had been shaken. Across the political spectrum, people believed that the future of Germany hung in the balance. Some argued for gradual reform and parliamentary government. Others demanded a revolutionary transformation of society. These competing visions collided in the streets of Berlin, creating an atmosphere in which political disagreements could rapidly become matters of life and death. The case also forces us to confront a difficult question that appears throughout history. What happens when a society undergoing profound change begins to view political opponents not merely as rivals, but as existential threats? In such moments, the line separating lawful authority from political violence can become dangerously blurred. Governments fear revolution. Revolutionaries fear repression. Both sides justify extraordinary measures in the name of survival. And often, ordinary legal protections become among the first casualties. The events of January 1919 unfolded against precisely this backdrop. They were not isolated incidents disconnected from the wider crisis. They were deeply intertwined with the struggle over who would shape Germany's future. For Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, the stakes could not have been higher. Their movement had recently suffered a devastating defeat. The revolutionary uprising associated with their cause had been crushed. The political environment had become increasingly hostile. Their supporters faced arrests, persecution, and violence. They themselves had gone into hiding. Yet, even in defeat, they remained influential figures whose ideas continued to inspire followers. Their voices carried weight. Their survival mattered. And perhaps that is what makes the events of January 15th so significant. These were not anonymous victims lost in the confusion of war. They were individuals whose deaths would resonate far beyond the moment in which they occurred. What followed their arrest would become the subject of intense controversy. The circumstances surrounding Liebknecht's final hours would be disputed. The fate of Luxemburg's body would remain uncertain for months. Questions regarding responsibility would linger through generations. Investigations would be criticized. Some participants would face legal consequences, while others would avoid meaningful accountability. Historians would continue debating the extent to which higher authorities knew about, approved of, or tolerated what happened. Even today, complete consensus remains elusive. Certain questions still lack definitive answers. But despite the debates, one fact remains undeniable. The deaths of Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht marked a turning point. They deepened divisions within German politics. They intensified hostility between rival factions on the left. They transformed both individuals into enduring symbols whose legacy would outlive the turbulent era that claimed their lives. Their names would be remembered not only because of what they stood for, but because of the circumstances under which they died. In this episode, we will trace the path that led from the collapse of an empire to a hotel in Berlin, from political revolution to political violence, and from official explanations to enduring historical controversy. We will examine the atmosphere that shaped these events, the uprising that preceded the arrests, the final hours of Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, the investigations that followed, and the questions that remain unresolved more than 100 years later. Because this is not simply the story of two deaths. It is the story of a nation in crisis, a struggle for power, and a moment when the future of Germany seemed to hang by a thread. And at the center of that story stand two figures whose final journey began on a cold January evening in 1919 and whose deaths continue to echo through history. To understand the deaths of Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, it is first necessary to understand the world that produced them. Their story did not begin on January 15, 1919. It began amid the collapse of an empire, the exhaustion of a nation, and the fierce struggle over what Germany would become after one of the deadliest wars in human history. By the end of 1918, Germany was a country transformed by defeat. For more than 4 years, the First World War had consumed enormous resources, claimed countless lives, and reshaped the political landscape of Europe. The conflict had demanded sacrifice on an unprecedented scale. Families across Germany had endured loss. Communities had watched young men leave for the front and never return. As the war dragged on, hardship became increasingly difficult to ignore. By the time the fighting finally ended, the Germany that emerged was not the Germany that had entered the conflict in 1914. In November 1918, the foundations of Imperial Germany collapsed. Kaiser Wilhelm II, the symbol of the old order, abdicated. The German Empire, which had dominated the country's political structure for decades, ceased to exist. The end of the monarchy created a vacuum that demanded immediate answers. Who would govern? What political system would replace the empire? How could a defeated nation rebuild itself while facing economic difficulties, social unrest, and deep political divisions? These questions were not abstract debates among intellectuals. They were urgent issues affecting millions of people whose futures seemed uncertain. Germany stood at a crossroads, and different groups offered radically different paths forward. A new government emerged under the leadership of Friedrich Ebert. Its goal was to stabilize the country and guide Germany through the dangerous transition from empire to republic. For many Germans, stability itself had become a precious commodity. After years of war and upheaval, there was a desire to restore order and prevent further chaos. Yet not everyone agreed that gradual reform was enough. For a growing revolutionary movement, the collapse of the empire represented more than a political transition. It represented an opportunity. They believed Germany stood on the threshold of a much deeper transformation, one that could fundamentally reshape society. Among the most influential voices advocating this vision were Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht. By late 1918, both individuals had become widely recognized figures within Germany's revolutionary left. Their influence extended far beyond small political circles. They were symbols of a broader movement seeking dramatic change at a moment when the country's future remained undecided, while supporters viewed them as courageous advocates for social transformation. Opponents regarded them as dangerous revolutionaries whose ideas threatened national stability. This sharp divide in public perception would ultimately shape the events that followed. Rosa Luxemburg occupied a unique position within the revolutionary movement. She was known for her commitment to socialist ideals and her belief that Germany required profound political and social change. In a period defined by uncertainty, she represented a clear and uncompromising vision of the future. Her ideas attracted followers who believed the end of the empire should lead not merely to a new government, but to a fundamentally different society. Luxemburg's influence stemmed not only from her political convictions, but also from her ability to articulate them during a period when many Germans were searching for answers. The collapse of old institutions had created space for new ideas, and Luxemburg became one of the most recognizable advocates for revolutionary transformation. At the same time, her prominence made her a target. The more influence she gained among supporters, the more concern she generated among opponents. To those who feared instability, revolution, or civil conflict, Luxemburg appeared not as a visionary, but as a threat. The divisions surrounding her reflected the broader divisions within Germany itself. The country was becoming increasingly polarized, and figures like Luxemburg often found themselves at the center of intense political conflict. Alongside her stood Karl Liebknecht, another leading figure of the revolutionary left. Like Luxemburg, he was closely associated with efforts to push Germany toward a more radical political future. His name became inseparable from the revolutionary movement that emerged during the final months of the war and the uncertain period that followed. Liebknecht's political significance rested not only on his individual role, but also on his partnership with Luxemburg. Together, they became among the most recognizable faces of a movement determined to challenge existing power structures. Their supporters viewed them as leaders capable of guiding Germany toward a new era. Their critics saw them as dangerous agitators capable of plunging the nation into further turmoil. As Germany struggled to define its future, revolutionary politics became increasingly organized. At the end of 1918, Luxemburg and Liebknecht participated in the formation of the Communist Party of Germany, commonly known as the KPD. The creation of the party represented a significant development in the rapidly changing political landscape. It provided a formal structure for those who believed Germany should follow a revolutionary path. The movement drew inspiration from events that had recently transformed Russia. The Russian Revolution of 1917 had demonstrated that dramatic political change was possible. For many revolutionaries across Europe, it served as both an example and a source of hope. Germany's revolutionaries believed their own country might be capable of undergoing a similar transformation. The emergence of the KPD intensified existing tensions. Germany was no longer simply debating political reform. It was confronting competing visions of the future that appeared increasingly difficult to reconcile. On one side stood those seeking stability through the newly established government. On the other stood revolutionaries who believed deeper changes were necessary. Both groups claimed to represent the interests of the German people. Both believed history favored their cause, and both viewed the stakes as extraordinarily high. The months following the collapse of the empire were characterized by uncertainty and confrontation. Political disagreements became increasingly emotional because they concerned fundamental questions about power, authority, and legitimacy. Every major issue seemed connected to the larger struggle over Germany's future. Should the country embrace gradual reform or revolutionary change? Should authority remain in the hands of the new government or shift to revolutionary movements? Could compromise still be achieved, or had political divisions become too deep? These questions dominated public life and shaped the atmosphere in which Luxemburg and Liebknecht operated. The city of Berlin became the focal point of these tensions. As the nation's capital, it served as both the political center of the new government and the heart of revolutionary activism. Demonstrations, political gatherings, and public debates reflected the intensity of the moment. The streets became arenas where competing visions of Germany confronted one another. Supporters of different factions viewed events through radically different lenses. One person's promise of liberation could appear to another as a threat to order. Trust between opposing camps steadily eroded. By the beginning of 1919, the political climate had become increasingly volatile. The optimism that accompanied the end of the war was overshadowed by uncertainty about what would come next. Revolutionary groups believed the moment for decisive action was approaching. Government leaders feared that instability could spiral out of control. Each side interpreted developments as evidence supporting its own concerns. The result was a growing sense that Germany was moving toward a confrontation that neither side could easily avoid. Within this atmosphere, Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht occupied positions of extraordinary visibility. Their names carried symbolic weight. They represented hopes, fears, ambitions, and anxieties that extended far beyond their individual roles. Supporters saw leaders who embodied the possibility of revolutionary change. Opponents saw figures who threatened an already fragile political order. The intensity of these perceptions ensured that any major confrontation would place them at the center of events. As January 1919 approached, Germany's political divisions continued to deepen. The collapse of the old empire had created opportunities, but it had also created dangers. The new republic remained fragile. Revolutionary movements remained active. Mutual distrust was widespread. In Berlin, tensions grew by the day. Neither side appeared willing to retreat from its vision of the future. The stage was set for a dramatic confrontation that would soon erupt into open conflict. When that moment arrived, Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht would find themselves at the heart of a crisis that would ultimately define both their lives and their legacy. The uprising that followed would change the course of German political history and set in motion the chain of events that led directly to their final days. The confrontation that many Germans had feared finally arrived in the opening days of January 1919. For weeks, tensions had been building beneath the surface of political life. The collapse of the German Empire had left a vacuum that competing movements sought to fill. The newly established government under Friedrich Ebert was attempting to stabilize a country, exhausted by war and uncertainty. At the same time, revolutionary groups believed the moment had come to push Germany toward a more radical transformation. These competing visions had coexisted uneasily during the final months of 1918, but by early 1919, coexistence was giving way to direct confrontation. What followed would become known as the Spartacist Uprising, a brief but consequential conflict whose failure would ultimately seal the fate of Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht. In Berlin, the atmosphere was increasingly volatile. Political disagreements were no longer confined to speeches, newspapers, or meetings. The struggle over Germany's future was becoming visible in the streets themselves. Revolutionary groups associated with the communist movement sought to challenge the authority of the new government. They believed the collapse of the old imperial order had created a unique opportunity to reshape society. To them, hesitation risked losing the momentum generated by revolution. The future seemed uncertain, but uncertainty itself could be interpreted as possibility. Many revolutionaries believed history was moving in their direction. During the first days of January 1919, these tensions erupted into action. Revolutionary groups launched what would later be known as the Spartacist Uprising. The movement involved a series of actions intended to challenge governmental authority and advance a revolutionary agenda. Participants occupied several newspaper offices, seeking to gain influence over public communication during a critical moment. Calls were made for the overthrow of the government. Demonstrations gathered supporters in the streets. Political conflict increasingly took on a physical dimension as confrontations occurred between opposing forces. The uprising represented a direct challenge to the fragile political order that had emerged after the fall of the empire. For supporters of the revolutionary cause, these actions represented an attempt to push Germany toward a fundamentally different future. For the government, however, the uprising appeared as a serious threat to national stability. The new republic was still in its infancy. Its leaders faced enormous pressure to establish authority and prevent further disorder. The possibility that revolutionary forces might gain momentum created fears of broader instability. Faced with what it perceived as a dangerous challenge, the government moved quickly to respond. Friedrich Ebert's administration turned to the Freikorps, right-wing paramilitary units composed largely of former soldiers. These forces were mobilized to suppress the uprising. Their deployment marked a decisive escalation. What had begun as a political confrontation increasingly became a violent struggle. Armed clashes erupted. Demonstrations transformed into scenes of conflict. The streets of Berlin reflected the deep divisions tearing through German society. Each side believed it was defending the nation's future. Each side viewed the other as a threat. Under such conditions, compromise became increasingly difficult. The suppression of the uprising was swift and brutal. Within a matter of days, the revolutionary effort was crushed. Hundreds of people were killed during the violence. Whatever hopes revolutionaries had of achieving immediate political transformation were shattered. The government retained control. The Freikorps emerged as a powerful force in restoring order. Yet victory on one side did not bring reconciliation. Instead, the events deepened existing animosities and intensified the sense of political polarization already gripping Germany. For Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, the consequences were immediate and dangerous. Both had become closely associated with the revolutionary movement. Whether viewed as leaders, symbols, or influential figures within the broader struggle, they were among the most recognizable individuals connected to the defeated cause. The collapse of the uprising transformed them from political actors into targets. Remaining visible carried significant risks. As authorities moved against revolutionary elements, Luxemburg and Liebknecht were forced into hiding. Their situation reflected the broader reality facing many individuals connected to the failed uprising. The revolutionary movement had suffered a major defeat. Support networks were under pressure. The political environment had become increasingly hostile. Every day carried uncertainty. Arrest appeared to be a growing possibility. While Berlin remained a large city, it was also a city under intense scrutiny. Revolutionary leaders could not assume they would remain hidden indefinitely. As the days passed, efforts to locate important figures associated with the uprising intensified. Authorities understood the symbolic importance of individuals such as Luxemburg and Liebknecht. Their capture would represent more than a routine arrest. It would demonstrate that the revolutionary challenge had been decisively defeated. Meanwhile, supporters worried about what might happen if the pair fell into hostile hands. The atmosphere surrounding their search was shaped by fear, tension, and uncertainty. Nobody could know exactly how events would unfold once they were found. That moment arrived on January 15, 1919. After several days in hiding, Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht were discovered in an apartment located in the Berlin district of Wilmersdorf. The search was over. Whatever hopes they may have had of avoiding capture disappeared. They were arrested and taken into custody. The significance of the arrest was immediately apparent. Two of the most prominent figures associated with the revolutionary movement had fallen into the hands of forces aligned with the victorious side of the conflict. Following their arrest, Luxemburg and Liebknecht were transported to the Eden Hotel in Berlin. Under ordinary circumstances, a hotel might seem like an unusual destination for political prisoners. Yet the building had become the headquarters of a Free Corps unit. More importantly, it served as the command center of forces that had participated in suppressing the uprising. Within its walls, military authority carried significant weight. It was here that the future of the two prisoners would be decided. The unit stationed at the hotel operated under the command of Captain Waldemar Pabst. His role would later become one of the most controversial aspects of the entire case. Historical evidence examined in subsequent years would indicate that a decision was made to eliminate Luxembourg and Liebknecht rather than place them on trial. This distinction is crucial. Had the two revolutionary leaders been processed through ordinary legal channels, their fate would have been determined by judicial proceedings. Instead, evidence would later suggest that another path was chosen. Inside the Eden Hotel, events moved toward a conclusion from which there would be no return. The uprising had already been crushed. The revolutionary movement had been defeated. Yet the presence of Luxembourg and Liebknecht in custody presented a new question. What should be done with two individuals whose names had become inseparable from revolutionary politics? To supporters, they remained political figures entitled to legal treatment. To opponents, they represented a continuing threat whose influence extended beyond the battlefield of the uprising itself. The answer that emerged that night would have consequences reaching far beyond the immediate moment. What makes the events of January 15th particularly chilling is that they occurred after the principal. Conflict had already been decided. The uprising had failed. Government authority had been restored. The revolutionary challenge had been suppressed. Yet despite this, the story was not moving toward legal resolution. Instead, it was moving toward violence. The Eden Hotel became the final known location where Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht were alive, in custody. Beyond that point, the paths of both individuals would diverge briefly before ending in death. At the time, those outside the building could not have known precisely what decisions were being made within its walls. Berlin remained a city struggling to recover from days of unrest. Rumors circulated constantly. Information was often incomplete or contradictory. Yet behind closed doors, events were unfolding that would soon become one of the most controversial episodes in modern German political history. The arrests that had appeared to mark the end of a revolutionary chapter were, in reality, the beginning of something far darker. The fate of Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht was no longer tied to the outcome of the uprising. That outcome had already been decided. Instead, their fate now depended upon the decisions of those who controlled their captivity. Within hours, both would be removed from the Eden Hotel. Official explanations would later attempt to describe what happened next. Those explanations would shape public understanding in the immediate aftermath. But over time, investigators, historians, and witnesses would challenge those accounts, revealing a sequence of events that looked increasingly less like the chaotic consequences of political unrest and increasingly more like deliberate political executions. The story of the uprising was ending. The story of the killings was about to begin. On the night of January 15th, 1919, Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht sat in captivity inside the Eden Hotel in Berlin. Only days earlier, the revolutionary uprising associated with their movement had collapsed. The political struggle that had shaken the capital appeared to be over. The government had regained control. The Free Corps had demonstrated their strength. The revolutionaries had been defeated. Yet for Luxemburg and Liebknecht, the most dangerous chapter was only beginning. What happened after their arrest would become one of the most controversial and disputed episodes in modern German history. It would also become a case defined by contradictions, official narratives, missing evidence, and a slow reconstruction of events that unfolded over decades. The first of the two revolutionary leaders to leave the Eden Hotel was Karl Liebknecht. Historical records indicate that he was taken from the building and placed into an automobile. At that moment, The exact intentions of those escorting him were known only to the individuals directly involved. To outside observers, it may have appeared that a prisoner was being transferred from one location to another. Such movements were not unusual during periods of political unrest. Yet what followed would quickly raise questions that never fully disappeared. Liebknecht was transported to the vicinity of Berlin's Tiergarten. According to the official version presented shortly afterward, he attempted to escape while in custody. Authorities claimed that during this alleged escape attempt, he was shot and killed. On paper, the explanation seemed simple. A prisoner had tried to flee. Armed personnel had responded. A fatal outcome had followed. In the volatile environment of post-war Berlin, such a story could plausibly fit within broader narratives of instability and violence. The authorities appeared to believe that the explanation would be accepted. But almost immediately, doubts emerged. The official account left unanswered questions. Critics wondered about the circumstances surrounding the supposed escape. Why had events unfolded in the manner described? Why did the explanation seem incomplete? Why were there inconsistencies that prevented the story from fully convincing many observers? These questions would grow louder over time rather than fade away. As later investigations examined the circumstances of Liebknecht's death, the official narrative came under increasing scrutiny. Historical research and subsequent inquiries challenged the claim that he had simply been shot while attempting to flee. Instead, evidence increasingly pointed toward a very different conclusion. Rather than an impulsive reaction to an escape attempt, the killing appeared to have been deliberate. The emerging picture suggested that Liebknecht had not died because he tried to evade custody. He had died because a decision had been made to eliminate him. This distinction transformed the meaning of the event. If true, it would mean that the official explanation had served not as an accurate account, but as a cover story for an intentional execution. The death of Karl Liebknecht marked only the first part of the night's tragedy. Soon afterward, Rosa Luxemburg was removed from the Eden Hotel. Her final journey would become even more disturbing and, in some ways, even more mysterious. Unlike Liebknecht, whose body was immediately available for public confirmation of his death, Luxemburg would vanish. For months, uncertainty would surround her fate, creating confusion, speculation, and rumors that spread throughout Germany. Witness accounts that later emerged described a violent sequence of events. According to those accounts, Luxemburg was struck in the head with the butt of a rifle while still under the control of her captors. The blow was severe. Reports indicated that she was either rendered unconscious or left in a condition close to unconsciousness. At that point, she was placed into a vehicle. Whatever opportunities may have existed for legal proceedings, public accountability, or judicial review had effectively disappeared. The situation was no longer moving toward a courtroom. It was moving toward a fatal conclusion. While being transported, Luxemburg was reportedly shot in the head at close range by a member of the Freikorps. The details were shocking not merely because of the violence involved, but because they suggested an execution carried out against a defenseless prisoner. The image that later emerged stood in stark contrast to any notion of lawful detention. Rather than being treated as an individual awaiting legal judgment, Luxemburg appeared to have been denied the protections ordinarily associated with justice. The violence did not end with her death. According to historical accounts, her body was taken to the Landwehr Canal and thrown into the water. This act created a second layer of mystery around the case. Unlike Liebknecht, whose death could be publicly announced, Luxemburg effectively disappeared. Her body was gone. The canal concealed crucial evidence and prevented immediate confirmation of what had happened. For supporters, family members, and political allies, the absence of a body transformed grief into uncertainty. Questions multiplied. Was she truly dead? Had she been secretly imprisoned elsewhere? Could she still be alive? In the absence of definitive answers, speculation flourished. The weeks that followed became a period of confusion and rumor. Individuals associated with Luxembourg searched for information. Supporters attempted to discover the truth. Stories circulated through political networks and among the public. Some accounts contradicted others. Without physical evidence, certainty remained elusive. The disappearance itself became part of the mystery. Every passing day, without confirmation, deepened the sense of unease surrounding the case. This uncertainty persisted for months. While Liebknecht's death had already become a source of controversy, Luxembourg's absence created an additional layer of unresolved questions. Her supporters were left without closure. The broader public lacked definitive answers. Political opponents and allies alike interpreted the situation through their own perspectives. In an already polarized society, the disappearance became yet another source of division. Finally, on May 31st, 1919, more than 4 months after her death, the uncertainty came to an end. Rosa Luxemburg's body was recovered from the Lambert Canal. Identification confirmed what many had suspected but could not previously prove. The revolutionary leader was dead. The discovery provided a crucial piece of evidence in reconstructing the events of January 15th. It also eliminated any remaining possibility that her disappearance could be explained through alternative theories. The body itself became a silent witness to the violence that had occurred. The recovery of Luxembourg's remains had a profound impact on public understanding of the case. Her death was no longer an allegation, a rumor, or an unresolved mystery. It was a confirmed reality. The discovery intensified scrutiny of the official accounts and renewed demands for answers. Attention increasingly focused on the circumstances of her final hours and on the broader question of responsibility. How had 2 prominent political prisoners ended up dead shortly after entering custody? Why had the explanations provided by authorities seemed so inconsistent with emerging evidence? Who had made the decisions that led to these outcomes? As investigators and historians examined the available information, a critical pattern began to emerge. The official narratives surrounding both deaths appeared increasingly difficult to reconcile with. The facts that surfaced later. Liebknecht had allegedly died while attempting to escape. Luxembourg had allegedly disappeared after being attacked. Yet subsequent findings suggested a different reality. Evidence pointed toward deliberate acts carried out against individuals already under control, rather than spontaneous incidents arising from confusion. The deaths increasingly resembled organized killings. This realization became the central twist of the entire case. The story that authorities initially presented and the story that later emerged were fundamentally different. In the official version, chaos played the dominant role. Violence was portrayed as an unfortunate consequence of disorder. Responsibility appeared diffuse and unclear. In the later reconstruction, however, chaos gave way to intention. Decisions appeared to have been made. Actions appeared coordinated. Responsibility seemed more direct. The distinction mattered enormously because it transformed the historical significance of the event. If the deaths resulted from confusion amid political unrest, they belonged to the tragic but familiar category of casualties produced by instability. If, however, they resulted from deliberate choices made by individuals in positions of authority, then they represented something far more serious. Political executions carried out outside the framework of law. The more researchers examined the available evidence, the more support emerged for the second interpretation. While certain details remained debated, a broad historical consensus gradually developed around the conclusion that the deaths of Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht were not spontaneous acts of violence. Instead, they were intentional killings carried out after the revolutionary leaders had already been taken into custody. This conclusion cast a long shadow over the events of January 1919 and raised troubling questions about the relationship between political power and accountability during one of Germany's most unstable periods. Yet, even as evidence accumulated and historical interpretations evolved, one problem remained. Establishing what happened was only part of the challenge. Determining who would be held responsible proved far more difficult. The deaths had shocked many observers. The discovery of contradictions had intensified public concern. Calls for accountability grew louder. But whether those demands would lead to meaningful justice remained uncertain. The next chapter of the story would focus not on the killings themselves, but on the investigations and legal proceedings that followed, a process that many critics would later argue failed to provide satisfactory answers for one of the most consequential political crimes of the 20th century. The deaths of Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht did not end the story. In many ways, they marked the beginning of a second struggle, one centered not on revolution or political power, but on truth, responsibility, and justice. Whenever a high-profile killing occurs, especially one involving prominent political figures, a fundamental question inevitably follows: who will be held accountable? In January 1919, that question carried enormous significance. Two of Germany's most recognizable revolutionary leaders had died shortly after being taken into custody. The official explanation surrounding their deaths had already generated skepticism, as evidence emerged that challenged those explanations. Public attention increasingly shifted toward the investigation itself. People wanted answers. They wanted to know what had happened, who had ordered it, and whether those responsible would face consequences. The response of the authorities would shape public perceptions of the case for decades to come. Following the deaths, a military investigation was opened. On the surface, this appeared to be a necessary and appropriate step. Serious allegations surrounded the circumstances of both killings. The deaths had become a matter of national importance. An inquiry offered the possibility of establishing facts, identifying responsible individuals, and restoring confidence in legal institutions. In theory, the investigative process could determine whether the official narratives accurately reflected reality. If wrongdoing had occurred, it could potentially provide a path toward accountability. Yet from the beginning, critics questioned whether the investigation would truly fulfill those goals. Germany in early 1919 remained a deeply divided nation. Political tensions had not disappeared with the suppression of the Spartacist uprising. The country was still struggling to stabilize itself after the collapse of the empire. Revolutionary movements and government authorities continued to view one another with suspicion. Under such circumstances, any inquiry into the deaths of Luxemburg and Liebknecht would inevitably be interpreted through a political lens. Supporters of the revolutionary movement worried that the investigation might be designed to protect those responsible rather than expose them. Opponents of the revolution often viewed the matter differently. The result was a climate in which confidence in the investigative process was fragile from the outset. As the inquiry progressed, criticism intensified. Many observers argued that the investigation lacked seriousness. Questions were raised about whether authorities were pursuing all available evidence with sufficient determination. Concerns emerged regarding impartiality. Was the inquiry genuinely seeking the truth, or was it attempting to contain political damage? Such questions became increasingly common as details surrounding the killings continued to attract public attention. The issue was no longer limited to the deaths themselves. It now encompassed the broader question of whether Germany's institutions were willing and able to confront politically sensitive crimes. The criticism stemmed in part from the nature of the emerging evidence. By this stage, significant doubts surrounded the official narratives. The claim that Karl Liebknecht had been shot while attempting to escape appeared increasingly difficult to sustain. Likewise, the circumstances of Rosa Luxemburg's disappearance and eventual recovery from the Landwehr Canal suggested a sequence of events far removed from the initial explanations provided to the public. As the gap between official accounts and later findings widened, expectations grew that the investigation would identify those responsible for creating or promoting misleading narratives. Yet many observers felt that such accountability remained elusive. Eventually, legal proceedings were initiated against certain members of the military forces connected to the events. For some observers, this represented a sign that the justice system was taking action. Individuals had been identified, charges had been brought, formal processes were underway. However, the outcomes of these proceedings soon became another source of controversy. Several lower-ranking participants faced prosecution, yet the consequences imposed by the courts were widely viewed as limited. Some individuals received relatively short prison sentences. Others were acquitted. For critics, these results appeared insufficient when measured against the gravity of the crimes involved. 2 political prisoners had died after being taken into custody. One had been shot after being removed from detention. The other had been beaten, killed, and disposed of in a canal. Given the seriousness of those actions, many people expected substantial penalties. Instead, the legal outcomes often seemed modest. The perception that justice had been only partially served became a recurring theme in discussions of the case. Perhaps even more significant than the sentences themselves was the issue of who remained untouched by the legal process. While certain lower-ranking figures faced scrutiny, many individuals associated with the killings avoided meaningful punishment altogether. This discrepancy fueled suspicions that the investigation had focused narrowly on a limited group of participants while failing to fully examine broader responsibility. The distinction between direct involvement and command responsibility became increasingly important. Even if some individuals carried out specific actions, who had authorized them? Who had created the conditions under which the killings occurred? Who had made the crucial decisions that transformed political prisoners into victims? These questions inevitably led attention toward Captain Waldemar Pabst. As commander of the Free Corps unit headquartered at the Eden Hotel, he occupied a central position in the historical narrative of the case. Evidence examined by later historians suggested that a decision had been made to eliminate Luxemburg and Liebknecht rather than place them on trial. Pabst's role in that decision became a focal point of controversy. Yet despite decades of scrutiny and debate, he was never convicted for his involvement in the events. For many critics, this fact symbolized the broader shortcomings of the investigative and judicial response. The individual most frequently associated with command responsibility escaped the legal consequences that many believed the case warranted. The absence of accountability at higher levels became one of the most enduring features of the story. While some participants encountered legal scrutiny, the broader structure of decision-making remained only partially illuminated. This created space for ongoing debate among historians and political observers. If key figures avoided prosecution, did that reflect a lack of evidence? Or did it reflect limitations within the political and legal environment of the time? Different interpretations emerged, but the controversy never fully disappeared. As the years passed, historians increasingly examined the broader context surrounding the killings. Their research extended beyond the actions of individual perpetrators and into the question of institutional responsibility. One of the most persistent debates concerned the role of the early Weimar government. Some historians argued that authorities may have tolerated the elimination of Luxemburg and Liebknecht because the revolutionary leaders represented a continuing political threat. According to this interpretation, the killings were not simply the actions of rogue individuals operating independently. Instead, they occurred within an atmosphere in which certain powerful actors may have viewed such outcomes as beneficial. It is important to note that these arguments remain the subject of historical debate. Researchers continue to disagree about the extent of governmental knowledge or involvement. The available evidence does not provide universally accepted answers to every question. Nevertheless, the very existence of such debates demonstrates how deeply the case continues to resonate. More than a century later, scholars are still examining whether responsibility extended beyond the immediate participants. Among the most important unresolved questions is whether the decision to kill Luxembourg and Liebknecht received approval from higher authorities. If so, who granted that approval? Was there a direct chain of command leading upward from those who carried out the killings? Or were the decisions made at a more limited level? Historians have explored these possibilities for decades, yet definitive answers remain elusive. The uncertainty contributes significantly to the enduring fascination surrounding the case. Another reason the case never fully closed in the public imagination is that many people viewed the investigative process itself as incomplete. Investigations are expected to provide clarity. Trials are expected to establish accountability. Yet in this instance, neither objective was fully achieved in the eyes of many observers. Important facts emerged gradually over time rather than through official proceedings. Questions remained unanswered. Individuals associated with key decisions escaped conviction. The result was a lingering sense that the historical record contained gaps that had never been satisfactorily filled. For supporters of Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, these shortcomings reinforced the belief that justice had been denied. For critics of the revolutionary movement, the case still raised uncomfortable questions about the methods used to suppress political opposition during a period of national crisis. Across ideological lines, many people recognized that the killings represented more than ordinary crimes. They reflected a moment when politics, violence, and state authority intersected in troubling ways. Ultimately, the investigations and trials produced a paradox. They confirmed that the deaths could not simply be dismissed as unfortunate accidents arising from chaos. Yet they failed to provide the comprehensive accountability that many expected. Some perpetrators faced consequences. Others did not. Certain facts became clearer. Others remained disputed. The legal process generated answers, but not enough answers to satisfy everyone. As a result, the story of Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht continued to evolve long after the courtroom proceedings ended. Their deaths had already altered Germany's political landscape. The investigations that followed ensured that the controversy would endure for generations. Questions about responsibility, institutional conduct, and political violence became inseparable from the historical memory of the case. And as Germany moved deeper into the turbulent decades that followed, the legacy of January 1919 would continue to influence political debates, historical scholarship, and public remembrance. The final chapter of the story would not focus on the killings or the trials, but on the lasting impact of those events, an impact that extended far beyond the lives that were lost and helped shape the course of German political history for decades to come. The deaths of Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht on January 15, 1919, marked the end of two lives, but they did not mark the end of their influence. In many ways, their deaths became more politically significant than any single action they had taken while alive. What began as a violent episode during a period of national turmoil evolved into a defining moment in German political history. The consequences reached far beyond the immediate aftermath of the killings. They shaped political relationships, influenced historical narratives, deepened ideological divisions, and transformed both Luxemburg and Liebknecht into enduring symbols whose names would continue to resonate long after the events of January 1919 had faded into the past. The immediate impact was felt within Germany's fractured political landscape. Before their deaths, Tensions already existed between the emerging communist movement and the government that had taken power after the collapse of the German Empire. The Spartacist uprising had intensified those tensions dramatically. The suppression of the revolt had left deep wounds. Yet the deaths of Luxembourg and Liebknecht elevated those wounds into something even more profound. To many supporters of the revolutionary movement, the killings became proof that political reconciliation was impossible. The deaths were not viewed merely as the loss of two leaders. They were viewed as evidence that the new political order was willing to use extraordinary measures against its opponents. As a result, hostility between revolutionary communists and the social democratic leadership of Germany deepened considerably. Distrust became more entrenched. Suspicions hardened into convictions. The possibility of cooperation between the two camps became increasingly remote. Political disagreements that might once have been addressed through negotiation were now interpreted through the memory of January 1919. The killings became a symbolic dividing line, one that reinforced the belief that each side represented a fundamental threat to the other. This development had lasting consequences for the Communist Party of Germany, or KPD. The deaths of Luxembourg and Liebknecht helped shape the party's view of the Weimar government. Rather than seeing the new republic as a potential partner in reform, many within the communist movement came to regard it as an adversary. The memory of the killings became intertwined with broader political grievances. Every debate about power, authority, and legitimacy carried echoes of what had happened in Berlin. The result was a political environment characterized by increasing polarization rather than reconciliation. The broader effects extended beyond the relationship between specific political parties. Germany during the 1920s was already vulnerable to instability. The country faced economic difficulties, social tensions, and competing ideological movements. In such an environment, events that deepened political divisions carried significant consequences. The deaths of Luxembourg and Liebknecht contributed to the radicalization of political discourse by reinforcing narratives of betrayal, victimization, and confrontation. Different groups interpreted the events according to their own beliefs, but few regarded them as insignificant. The killings became part of the larger story of a nation struggling to define itself after the collapse of an empire. Historians often point to the years following 1919 as a period during which political extremism gained strength in Germany. The divisions between moderates and revolutionaries became increasingly difficult to bridge. Trust in institutions remained fragile. Many citizens felt alienated from political processes. Within this broader context, the deaths of Luxembourg and Liebknecht acquired symbolic importance that extended far beyond the circumstances of the killings themselves. They became reference points in larger debates about democracy, revolution, and the limits of political power. Perhaps one of the most remarkable aspects of the case is the way in which the two victims were transformed into symbols. During their lifetimes, Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht were political actors engaged in active struggles over Germany's future. After their deaths, however, they increasingly became figures of memory and commemoration. Supporters viewed them as martyrs, individuals who had paid the ultimate price for their beliefs. Their deaths were interpreted not simply as political killings, but as sacrifices that embodied larger struggles for social and political change. This process of symbolic transformation extended beyond Germany. Across the international communist movement, Luxembourg and Liebknecht became powerful icons. Their names were invoked in speeches, writings, commemorations, and political education. The circumstances of their deaths reinforced the perception that they had been victims of political repression. As a result, their influence continued long after their physical presence had disappeared. They became part of a broader narrative about revolution, resistance, and political commitment. The symbolic power of their memory became particularly evident in East Germany after the Second World War. There, Luxembourg and Liebknecht were officially celebrated as revolutionary heroes. Their legacy occupied an important place within state-sponsored historical narratives. Annual commemorations took place in Berlin, ensuring that new generations would learn about their lives and deaths. Through ceremonies, public remembrance, and political symbolism, the two figures remained central to interpretations of German history promoted by the East German state. These commemorations reflected more than historical interest. They demonstrated how political memory can shape collective identity. The deaths of Luxembourg and Liebknecht were no longer simply historical events. They became symbols through which larger questions about justice, revolution, and political legitimacy were explored. Their memory served different purposes for different groups, but remained remarkably resilient. Decades passed, governments changed, ideologies rose and fell. Yet the names Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht continued to occupy a significant place in discussions about Germany's past. At the same time, the case never fully escaped controversy. Historical debate continued long after the immediate political circumstances had disappeared. Researchers examined documents, testimonies, and official records in an effort to better understand what had happened and why. While broad agreement emerged regarding the nature of the killings, important questions remained unresolved. How extensive was the involvement of higher authorities? Did responsibility extend beyond the individuals who directly participated in the killings? Was there approval from levels of government beyond those immediately associated with the Free Corps? These questions have never been answered to everyone's satisfaction. The uncertainty surrounding these issues contributes significantly to the enduring fascination of the case. Historical events often become easier to interpret when responsibility is clearly established and accountability is achieved. In the case of Luxembourg and Liebknecht, however, ambiguity remained. Certain facts became increasingly clear over time. The evidence strongly supported the conclusion that both deaths were deliberate killings rather than spontaneous acts of violence. Yet the full chain of responsibility remained difficult to reconstruct. As a result, historians continue to debate aspects of the case more than a century after it occurred. Another reason the story continues to resonate is the stark contrast between the official explanations initially provided and the conclusions reached through later investigation. The authorities claimed that Karl Liebknecht had been shot while attempting to escape. Rosa Luxemburg's fate was initially obscured by confusion surrounding her disappearance. Yet subsequent evidence painted a dramatically different picture. The contrast between these narratives raises broader questions about power, information, and accountability during periods of political crisis. When governments or institutions control the flow of information, how can truth be established? How long can misleading narratives survive before evidence challenges them? The case of Luxembourg and Liebknecht offers a powerful example of how historical understanding can evolve over time. As we reach the end of this story, it is worth returning to the image with which we began. Berlin in January 1919 was a city suspended between past and future. The old empire had fallen. The new republic was fragile. Competing visions of society clashed in the streets. Amid this uncertainty, two prominent political figures were arrested, removed from public view, and killed. Official explanations attempted to define what had happened. Yet history refused to accept those explanations at face value. Over time, investigators, witnesses, and historians reconstructed a different story, one in which the deaths of Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht appeared not as accidents of chaos, but as deliberate acts carried out in the aftermath of political conflict. Their story endures because it touches on questions that remain relevant far beyond Germany in 1919. How should societies confront political extremism? What limits should exist on the use of power during periods of crisis? Can justice survive when political fear overwhelms legal safeguards? And what happens when individuals become symbols larger than themselves? These questions have no simple answers. Yet they continue to emerge whenever historians revisit the events of January 1919. More than a century later, the names Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht remain inseparable from one of the most controversial political killings in modern European history. Their deaths helped shape the future of German politics, influenced generations of political thought, and became enduring reminders of the dangers that arise when ideological conflict and political violence intersect. The precise details of every decision made that night may never be fully known. Certain debates may continue indefinitely, but one reality remains clear. The events of January 15, 1919, were not merely a footnote in the aftermath of war. They became a defining chapter in the history of modern Germany, a chapter that continues to provoke reflection, debate, and remembrance more than 100 years later. And perhaps that is why the story still matters today, not because it offers easy answers, but because it reveals how fragile justice can become when a nation stands at the edge of profound political change. More than a century has passed since the night Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht were taken from the Eden Hotel and killed. The Germany in which those events occurred no longer exists. The German Empire is gone. The Weimar Republic that emerged from its collapse has long since passed into history. The ideological battles that defined the early 20th century have transformed in ways that few people living in 1919 could have imagined. Entire political systems have risen and fallen. Borders have changed. Generations have come and gone. Yet despite the immense distance separating the present from that cold January night, the story refuses to disappear. One reason for this enduring fascination lies in the fact that the case exists at the intersection of history, politics, and crime. It is not merely a political event. It is not merely a historical controversy. It is also the story of two human beings who entered custody alive and left it dead. At its core, the case raises questions that transcend ideology. Regardless of one's political beliefs, the fundamental issue remains the same. What happens when violence replaces legal process? What happens when individuals who should face judgment in public instead meet their fate behind closed doors? Those questions remain relevant in every era because they concern the relationship between power and accountability. The deaths of Luxemburg and Liebknecht also reveal how history is often shaped not only by events themselves, but by the stories told about those events. In the immediate aftermath of the killings, official explanations attempted to define public understanding. Karl Liebknecht was said to have been shot while trying to escape. Rosa Luxemburg was initially portrayed through narratives that obscured the reality of what had occurred. Had those accounts remained unchallenged, the historical memory of the case might have been very different. Instead, later investigations, testimony, and research gradually reconstructed a more complete picture. The process took years. In some respects, it took decades. The truth did not emerge all at once. It emerged piece by piece. That gradual reconstruction serves as a reminder that historical understanding is often imperfect. Events occur in real time, but their meaning may remain contested long afterward. Witnesses disagree. Records are incomplete. Political interests shape narratives. Historians revisit old evidence and ask new questions. The story of Luxemburg and Liebknecht demonstrates how difficult it can be to separate fact from interpretation, especially when powerful institutions are involved. Yet it also demonstrates the importance of continuing to ask questions even when definitive answers seem out of reach. Another reason the case continues to resonate is the symbolic role the victims came to occupy. During their lives, Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht were political leaders engaged in active struggles. After their deaths, they became symbols. Supporters remembered them as martyrs. Opponents viewed them through different lenses. Historians analyzed their significance within broader political movements. Over time, the individuals themselves became inseparable from the meanings attached to them. This transformation is common in history. When prominent figures die violently, public memory often turns them into symbols representing causes, movements, or ideals. Yet behind those symbols remain real human beings whose lives ended abruptly and violently. The story also illustrates how moments of national crisis can reshape moral boundaries. Germany in early 1919 was experiencing extraordinary instability. The old order had collapsed. The future was uncertain. Fear, anger, and political polarization influenced decision-making at every level of society. In such circumstances, actions that might once have seemed unthinkable can become easier to justify. Political opponents become perceived enemies. Extraordinary measures become framed as necessities. Legal protections become vulnerable to erosion. Looking back from the present, it is tempting to view such developments as inevitable. But history suggests otherwise. The events of January 1919 were the result of choices made by individuals operating within a specific environment. Understanding those choices is essential to understanding the tragedy itself. For modern observers, perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the case is how familiar some of its themes remain. Political polarization, distrust of institutions, competing versions of reality, conflicts over legitimacy and authority. These are not issues confined to a distant past. They continue to appear in different forms across the world today. The circumstances surrounding the deaths of Luxemburg and Liebknecht remind us that democratic institutions and legal safeguards are often tested most severely during periods of crisis. The strength of those institutions is measured not when conditions are stable, but when tensions are at their highest. The enduring debate surrounding responsibility further contributes to the case's historical significance. Although broad agreement exists that the killings were deliberate, questions concerning the full chain of command remain subjects of discussion. Historians continue examining the extent of involvement by various actors. They continue debating the degree of responsibility borne by individuals and institutions. These debates are not merely academic. They reflect a broader human desire to understand how such events become possible. When accountability appears incomplete, historical curiosity often persists. People continue searching for explanations because unresolved questions create a sense of unfinished business. Yet there is another dimension to the story that deserves attention. Beyond the political consequences, beyond the historical debates, beyond the symbolism, there remains a simple human tragedy. Two people who believed deeply in their political cause were captured and killed. Their deaths devastated supporters and shocked observers. Families, friends, colleagues, and allies were left to grapple with loss. The broader historical significance of the case should not obscure that reality. Every major historical event is ultimately experienced by individuals. Behind every political conflict are human lives affected by its outcomes. Today, the names Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht continue to appear in books, documentaries, academic studies, and public commemorations. Their story remains part of the historical identity of modern Germany. It serves as a case study in political violence, a warning about the dangers of polarization, and an example of how official narratives can be challenged by later evidence. It also stands as a reminder that history rarely provides perfect closure. Some questions remain unanswered. Some debates continue. Some wounds never fully disappear. As we conclude this story, We return one final time to Berlin in January 1919. A city emerging from war, a nation struggling to define its future. Two revolutionary leaders arrested after a failed uprising. An evening that began with captivity and ended with death. At first, the truth appeared buried beneath official statements and political turmoil. Yet history has a way of revisiting unfinished stories. Over the decades, investigators, witnesses, and historians continued searching for answers. Their efforts transformed a contested incident into one of the most studied political killings in German history. The final lesson of the case may be that truth and accountability do not always arrive together. Evidence may emerge, yet justice may remain incomplete. Facts may become clearer, yet responsibility may still be debated. The story of Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht embodies that tension. It is a story in which certainty and uncertainty coexist. We know more today than those who first heard the official reports in 1919. Yet some mysteries endure. And perhaps that is why the case continues to command attention after more than 100 years. It is not only a story about the past. It is also a story about memory, power, and the ongoing search for truth. The gunshots that ended 2 lives on January 15, 1919, echoed far beyond that night. They echoed through the history of the Weimar Republic. They echoed through decades of political conflict. They echoed through generations of historians attempting to reconstruct what happened. And even now, those echoes have not entirely faded.